There are moments in life that become frozen in amber, preserved with such clarity that decades cannot erode them. For Reginald Reed Jr., one such moment was the taste of a chocolate chip cookie at Hammond Square Mall on August 22, 1987. He was 6 years old. His mother, Selonia, had bought it for him. He remembers her kissing him goodbye later that evening. Everything after that moment dissolved into shadows, fragments of memory too painful to hold, too important to forget. What Reggie didn't know then, what he couldn't have known, was that this cookie would become the last gift his mother ever gave him. By the next morning, 26-year-old Salonia Ophelia Smith Reed would be dead, her body discovered in her blue 1986 Chevrolet Sprint, brutally murdered in a way that suggested something far more personal than a random act of violence. This is a story about what happens when the person you trust most becomes the person you should have feared. It's about how a 6-year-old boy can unknowingly become the alibi for his mother's killer. And it's about how justice, though delayed for 32 years, can still find its way through the darkness. But perhaps most importantly, this is a story told from an angle you won't hear in most true crime narratives. Not from the perspective of detectives or prosecutors, not from the lens of forensic science or legal procedure, but through the fractured memories and devastating awakening of a child who grew up in the shadow of an unspeakable truth. To understand what was lost on that August night in 1987, you must first understand who Salonia Reed was, not as a victim, not as a case file, but as a living, breathing woman who filled every room she entered with warmth. Born on December 13, 1960, Selonia Ophelia Smith grew up in Hammond, Louisiana, a small city about 45 miles north of New Orleans. She was the middle daughter in a trio of sisters that included Gwen and Jacqueline, whom everyone called Jackie. The three girls shared something rare and precious, a bond forged not just by blood but by genuine friendship. They were each other's confidants, each other's champions, each other's safe harbor. Friends called her Lonnie, and the nickname suited her: bright, quick, unforgettable. She had a generous spirit and a way of making people feel seen. If you needed help, Salonia was the first to offer it. If you needed someone to listen, she would sit with you for hours. Her caring nature led her to work at 7th Ward General Hospital, where she could put her compassion into action every single day. In 1986, Salonia made a career change. She left the hospital to become a teller at Citizens National Bank. It was a good job, stable, with regular hours that would allow her to spend more time with the light of her life, her son, Reggie. Born on Christmas Eve, 1980, Reginald Reed Jr. was Salonia's world. She poured herself into motherhood with the same generous spirit she brought to everything else. When Reggie was happy, Salonia was radiant. When he needed her, nothing else mattered. She was the kind of mother who made her child feel like he was the most important person in any room. But there was something else in Salonia's life, something that cast a long shadow over all that light: her marriage to Reginald Reed Sr. From the outside, the Reeds appeared to be a typical American family. They lived at 1314 Apple Street in Hammond, a modest home walking distance from downtown. Reginald Sr. worked and provided for his family. They had a son they both loved. To casual observers, they seemed fine. But families are like icebergs. What you see on the surface is only a fraction of what exists beneath. Behind the closed door of 1314 Apple Street, Salonia had confided to her sisters about physical abuse. According to family members who would later testify, she had spoken about the violence she endured at the hands of her husband. She had mentioned divorce, whispered about the possibility of leaving, of taking Reggie and starting over somewhere safe. Divorce in the 1980s, particularly in a small southern city like Hammond, carried weight. It wasn't just a legal process, it was a social statement, a declaration that something sacred had failed. For Salonia, who valued her family and her reputation in the community, contemplating divorce must have felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, terrifying, but perhaps the only way forward. Reginald Sr.'s sister, Claudette, would later give an interview claiming that he had been abusive not only to his wife but also to his own sister growing up. The pattern of control, of violence, of dominance, it stretched back into his childhood, a learned behavior that had calcified into something dangerous. But in August of 1987, Selonia was still there, still trying to navigate her marriage, still doing everything she could to protect her son from the ugliness that sometimes erupted when the front door closed and the neighbors couldn't see inside. She had no way of knowing that time was running out. It was a Saturday, hot and humid in the way only a Louisiana summer can be, the kind of heat that settles on your skin like a second layer and makes the air shimmer above the asphalt. For 6-year-old Reggie, it was just another day, filled with the simple pleasures of childhood. Selonia took Reggie to Hammond Square Mall that afternoon. He would later remember this trip with the kind of crystalline clarity that only significant moments achieve, his mother buying him that chocolate chip cookie, the sweetness of it, the way she smiled at him. According to witness accounts, Selonia had invited her sister Gwen to join them, but had not mentioned her husband coming along. This detail would later become important because Reginald Sr. would claim that all three of them, he, Selonia, and Reggie, went to the mall together. But multiple witnesses would contradict this story. Their neighbor, a woman named Short, testified that she saw Selonia and Reggie driving to the mall, but Reginald Sr. was not in the car. An officer named Alberton said the same thing. He saw Selonia and young Reggie at the mall, but not the boy's father. Already, Reginald Sr.'s version of events was beginning to unravel, though no one knew it yet. Later that evening, Selonia's sister Jackie was visiting from New Orleans. She had been staying at the Reed home for about a week while Reginald Sr. was away on business. Now that he was back, Jackie would be returning to her own home. The evening seemed ordinary, time spent with family, the comfortable rhythms of everyday life. Then came the moment Reggie remembers so clearly, his mother kissing him goodbye. She told him, or perhaps his father told him, the memories blur here, that she was going out with a friend. Reggie accepted this without question because that's what 6-year-olds do. They trust. They believe. They don't question why a mother who adores them would leave on a Saturday night. According to Reginald Sr.'s account, he and Reggie spent the evening playing video games together before falling asleep on the same sofa bed. It was a comfortable story, a father-son bonding narrative that painted a picture of domestic normalcy. But Selonia never came home. At approximately 6:30 in the morning on August 23, Reginald Sr. called Selonia's sister Gwen. He wanted to know where Selonia was. Gwen had no idea what he was talking about. She hadn't seen her sister since the previous day. Concern turned to alarm. An hour later, at approximately 7:30 a.m., Reginald Sr. contacted the Hammond Police Department to file a missing person report. The officer who took the call was Charles Muse, now retired but at the time a dedicated member of the force who would become intimately connected with this case. Here's where the timeline becomes chilling. Within approximately 60 minutes of that missing person report, Selonia's body was discovered. Officer Muse himself found her. The location was a vacant lot near John's Curb Market, a convenience store on East Thomas Street. The market was only 3 blocks from the police station and approximately 1.5 miles from the Reed home on Apple Street. Close enough to walk, certainly close enough to drive in just a few minutes. Selonia's blue 1986 Chevrolet Sprint was parked there, and when Officer Muse looked inside, what he saw would haunt him for decades. Selonia's body was positioned between the bucket seats of the small car, her torso slumped over into the back seat. She had been stripped partially naked, her blouse torn off, her pants removed. What Officer Muse and the investigators who followed discovered was a scene of almost incomprehensible violence and rage. Selonia had suffered blunt force trauma to her face, beaten so severely that her features were distorted. But that wasn't what killed her. What killed her were the 16 pinpoint stab wounds covering her upper torso, shoulder, and neck. These weren't the wild, random strikes of a stranger in a frenzy. They were precise, calculated, personal. The medical examiner, Dr. Vincent Cefalu, would later determine that 3 of those wounds had penetrated the right middle lobe of her lungs, and 1 had pierced the right atrium of her heart. Selonia had, quite literally, died of a broken heart, torn apart by someone who had stabbed her with what investigators believed was an instrument the caliber of a Phillips screwdriver. But the horror didn't end there. Salonia had been sexually violated with an umbrella that was found at the scene, the handle visible between her legs. There was also a white substance on her body, lotion that had been smeared across her skin. Some investigators theorized that her killer had drawn or written something in her blood using this white substance, though whatever message had been left didn't melt in the intense August heat. Its meaning, if any, was never deciphered. Lieutenant Barry Ward, who would take over the case years later, noted something crucial at the crime scene: the lack of blood in the car. Given the severity of Salonia's injuries, there should have been significantly more blood. This strongly suggested that she had been murdered elsewhere, likely in her own home, and then her body had been transported to the parking lot near John's Curb Market. The positioning of the body told another story too. Salonia was in the passenger seat, not the driver's seat. Someone else had driven her car to this location, with her deceased or dying body beside them. Someone who knew where they were going. Someone who had planned this. And there was one more piece of evidence at the scene: a cigarette butt. It seemed innocuous at the time, just another piece of trash in a crime scene. But that cigarette would eventually become the key that unlocked 32 years of silence. He didn't win. But the fact that he had the confidence, some might say the audacity, to run for public office while being the primary suspect in his wife's unsolved murder tells you something about Reginald Reed Sr. He believed he had gotten away with it. And for 32 years, he was right. What is it like to grow up as the son of a suspected murderer? To be raised by a man who the entire town whispers about, whose name is synonymous with an unsolved crime. For Reggie Reed Jr., childhood after his mother's death was complicated. He had no mother to protect him, to soften the sharp edges of his father's personality. Reginald Sr. was, by all accounts including his son's, a strict disciplinarian. Reggie later described his upbringing as not traditional, and admitted his father was tough. "Most kids look forward to summertime, but I didn't," Reggie recalled years later. "I knew my dad would make me read for hours at a time." When asked about the abuse that Salonia's sisters mentioned, physical violence they said Reginald inflicted on his wife, Reggie was careful in his response. "I didn't get beat," he said. "I caught whoopings with a belt. I got spanked, but it wasn't to the point where I feel like I was abused." But there's an interesting caveat in that statement: "I was 6. Who can say?" The truth is that Reggie's memories of his childhood are complicated by trauma, by the natural psychological defenses children build to survive difficult circumstances, and by the fact that the man raising him was suspected of murdering his mother. How do you form accurate memories under those conditions? Reggie's father never spoke about the murder in detail. Young Reggie learned quickly not to ask questions. The subject of his mother's death became a forbidden territory in their home, a wound too painful to touch, a story too dangerous to tell. When Reggie was a teenager, his curiosity finally overcame his fear. He went to the public library in Hammond and looked up the newspaper archives about his mother's murder. That's when he learned the gruesome truth that his father had shielded him from, or perhaps that his father wanted to keep hidden. Salonia hadn't just been killed. She had been beaten, stabbed more than 16 times, and sexually assaulted with an umbrella. The crime was vicious, personal, rage-filled. And Reginald Reed Sr., Reggie's father, the man who raised him, who made him read for hours in the summer, who had been with him every day since he was 6 years old, was the primary suspect. How do you process that information at 17? How do you reconcile the father you know with the monster described in those newspaper accounts? Reggie tried to shut out the whispers. When his father ran for mayor in his senior year of high school, Reggie remembers feeling excited about it. He didn't win, Reggie said, but also nothing came up about the murder, which is crazy. The fact that the murder wasn't mentioned during his father's mayoral campaign suggests how deeply the case had gone cold, how much the community had moved on, or perhaps how successful Reginald Sr. had been at presenting an alternative image of himself. But for Reggie, the knowledge remained, sitting in his mind like a stone in his shoe, uncomfortable, impossible to ignore, yet somehow bearable enough that life could continue. In 2011, 32 years after Salonia's murder, Louisiana State Police Lieutenant Barry Ward requested permission to examine the old evidence from the Reed case. Ward had only been 16 years old in 1987, a sophomore at Marshall County High School in western Kentucky. The Salonia Reed case wasn't even in Louisiana then. It was just another murder in a small southern town that he'd never heard of. But now, as an experienced investigator with the benefit of modern forensic technology, Ward saw an opportunity. DNA analysis had advanced dramatically since 1987. What had once been impossible was now routine. Evidence that sat in storage for decades could suddenly speak again. Ward went through every piece of physical evidence collected from Salonia's car: a child's toy, an umbrella, a purse, a wallet, a comb, makeup, photographs, credit cards, and that cigarette butt. In 2012, advanced DNA testing was performed on the cigarette. The saliva on it contained genetic material, and when that material was run through the system, it produced a match: Jimmy Ray Barnes. Remember Jimmy Ray Barnes? The handyman who had been seen with Reginald Sr. at the car wash near John's Curb Market on the night of Salonia's murder? The man who had passed a polygraph test in 1987 and then fled the state shortly after? Now his DNA was literally at the crime scene, deposited on a cigarette found in Salonia's car. But there was a problem. Jimmy Ray Barnes had left Louisiana decades ago. Lieutenant Ward didn't have the resources to track him down across state lines. The case, despite this breakthrough, remained stuck. Sometimes justice needs a champion outside the criminal justice system. For the Selonia Reed case, the champion turned out to be investigative reporter H.L. Arledge. Arledge had first written about the Selonia Reed case back in 1997, 10 years after the murder. He published an editorial asking a simple but powerful question: whatever happened to Selonia Reed? The editorial prompted a local radio station host, Mary Perosco, to invite Arledge onto her show, Hammond America. He discussed the case on air, and listeners called in, shocked and angry that no one had ever been charged with Salonia's murder. The case became the talk of the town again, at least briefly. 4 months after that radio show, Reginald Reed Sr. announced his candidacy for mayor. Arledge never forgot about Salonia. Years later, after living in California for a decade, he returned to Louisiana in 2012 and began writing about the case again. In October 2018, he interviewed Hammond Police Chief James Stewart and learned something disturbing. Recently retired investigators had closed the case on their way out of the department. The closure code they used translated to "cleared by exceptional means," which means investigators had identified the perpetrators but, for various reasons, could not prosecute. In other words, the Hammond Police Department knew who killed Salonia Reed but had decided they couldn't prove it in court. Arledge kept writing. He kept asking questions. He kept Salonia's name in the public consciousness. And eventually, his persistence paid off. In 2018, a young prosecutor named Taylor Anthony was hired by District Attorney Scott Perilou. Anthony had been a prosecutor in Orleans Parish for 7 years, but he was relatively new to Tangipahoa Parish. Perilou handed him the Reed file. Anthony was only 2 years old when Salonia was murdered. He had no connection to the case, no preconceived notions, no local politics to navigate. He looked at the evidence with fresh eyes and came to a clear conclusion: all I did was look at the case for what it was. I read the files, and I saw a man that killed his wife. But Anthony knew that without Jimmy Ray Barnes, they didn't have enough to prosecute. He needed to find Barnes, needed to get him to talk, needed to turn him against Reginald Reed. Anthony solicited the help of Louisiana State Police investigator Barry Ward, the same Lieutenant Ward who had gotten the DNA match on the cigarette butt. Together, they made a master list of witnesses and treated the 31-year-old case like it had happened yesterday. Then came the big ask. Anthony wanted to travel to Atlanta, Georgia, to find and interview Jimmy Ray Barnes. This wasn't standard procedure. It was expensive, time-consuming, and there was no guarantee Barnes would even talk to them. But District Attorney Perilou took a leap of faith. In Georgia, Anthony and Ward tracked Barnes down. He was 61 years old, on dialysis, facing serious health challenges. His body was failing him, and perhaps he knew his time was running out. During the initial interview, Barnes corroborated much of what other witnesses had said. But as Anthony and Ward were about to leave, Barnes said something that stopped them in their tracks. "I want you boys to know that I'm the key to it all. And if you think you can indict me for murder, then do it." It was a challenge, a dare, and perhaps, in some twisted way, a plea. Anthony was quick to take him up on it. On June 21, 2019, a grand jury in Tangipahoa Parish returned second-degree murder indictments for both Reginald Reed Sr. and Jimmy Ray Barnes. That same day, Lieutenant Barry Ward went to Reginald's home. He knocked on the door, identified himself, and informed Reginald that he had an arrest warrant for the murder of Selonia Reed. Ward would later recall that Reginald really had no emotion. After 32 years of living as a free man, after decades of believing he had gotten away with murder, Reginald Reed Sr. was finally under arrest. For Reggie Reed Jr., now 38 years old, the news was devastating. The whispers he had tried to ignore his entire life were becoming legal facts. The father who had raised him, who had been his only parent for his entire life, was being accused of murdering his mother. And there was another cruel twist: Reggie himself would likely be called as a witness. The 6-year-old boy who had given his father an alibi would now have to testify as an adult about the night his mother died. As part of a plea deal, Jimmy Ray Barnes agreed to testify against Reginald Reed in exchange for leniency. He pleaded guilty to accessory after the fact to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 5 years, the maximum sentence for that reduced charge. Barnes's story, when he finally told it, was chilling in its specificity. According to Barnes, Reginald Reed had offered him $50,000 to help make his wife disappear. On the night of August 22, 1987, Barnes received a call from Reginald. When he arrived at a prearranged location near John's Curb Market, he found Reginald in Salonia's blue Chevrolet Sprint. Salonia's body was in the car with him, already dead, already brutalized. Barnes claimed he gave Reginald a ride away from the scene after Reginald had positioned Salonia's body. He maintained that he hadn't participated in the actual murder, only in the disposal and cover-up. Whether this was the complete truth or a version crafted to minimize his own culpability is impossible to know. The dead cannot testify, and Barnes had every reason to make himself look as innocent as possible while still providing enough information to secure his deal. But his testimony provided crucial pieces of the puzzle. It explained the witness's account of seeing both men at the car wash near John's Curb Market. It explained the cigarette with Barnes's DNA. Most importantly, it linked Reginald Reed directly to the crime scene with Salonia's body. The prosecutor's theory, based on Barnes's testimony and the physical evidence, was that Reginald had murdered Salonia in their bedroom on Apple Street while 6-year-old Reggie slept in another part of the house. Reginald then placed her body in her car, drove to the parking lot near John's Curb Market, arranged the body to stage a scene that suggested sexual assault by a stranger, and called Jimmy Ray Barnes to pick him up. Barnes arrived, saw the aftermath of Reginald's violence, and agreed to help him for money. Then Reginald walked the approximately 1.5 miles home, cleaned the bedroom to remove any evidence of the murder, woke up Reggie, told him his mother had gone out with a friend, and spent the rest of the night establishing his alibi with his son. When morning came, he called Salonia's sister Gwen to ask where Salonia was, setting up the pretense that he was worried about her absence. Then he called the police to report her missing, knowing that her body would be found soon and wanting to appear like a concerned husband. It was a plan that almost worked perfectly. During their investigation, prosecutors discovered something that provided a powerful motive. In the year leading up to Salonia's murder, Reginald Reed had purchased 5 life insurance policies on his wife through 2 different life insurance companies. 3 of those policies were issued just days before Salonia's murder. The total value of all the policies, including an accidental death benefit rider, was $707,682, a massive sum, especially in 1987 dollars. Adjusted for inflation to current values, that would be over $1.6 million today. Reginald had taken out these policies covertly, without Salonia's full knowledge, or at least without her understanding of the total amount. He had planned this. He had prepared for her death. And when she died, he collected that money. For 32 years, Reginald Reed lived on his wife's blood money. He raised their son on it. He ran for mayor on it. He built a life on it. And when the money eventually ran out, decades later, Reginald Reed, still a free man, still never charged with any crime, applied to draw his late wife's Social Security benefits. The audacity is breathtaking. In November 2022, 35 years after Salonia's murder, Reginald Reed Sr. finally stood trial. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Taylor Anthony and Assistant District Attorney Angel Monastir. They presented a case built on circumstantial evidence, witness testimony, the DNA on the cigarette butt, the life insurance policies, the documented history of abuse, and the lies Reginald had told about his whereabouts on the night of the murder. Jimmy Ray Barnes, now frail and ill but still coherent, testified against Reginald. He described seeing Reginald with Salonia's body in the car. He testified about picking Reginald up from the scene. His testimony was devastating because it came from someone who had been there, who had seen the aftermath of Reginald's rage, who could place Reginald at the crime scene with his dead wife. The defense, led by attorneys Vanessa Williams and LaToya Williams-Simon, argued that the evidence was circumstantial. They pointed out that there was no physical evidence directly linking Reginald to the murder, no blood on his clothes, no murder weapon with his fingerprints, no witnesses to the actual killing. They argued that Jimmy Ray Barnes was an unreliable witness with every reason to lie to save himself. And they called witnesses of their own. Jacob DeVoe testified that he had been in jail with Jimmy Ray Barnes at one point, and that Barnes had told him a completely different story, that Barnes and his brother Billy Ray had been paid to kill Salonia after she was caught having an affair, that Jimmy Ray used a hammer while Billy Ray used an ice pick, and that the Barnes brothers had disposed of the body. This alternative narrative suggested that Barnes was the actual killer and was now blaming Reginald to avoid a longer sentence. But perhaps the most emotionally wrenching testimony came from Reginald Reed Jr. himself, now 41 years old, a husband and father, standing in a courtroom to testify about the night his mother died. Reggie testified that he vaguely remembered playing video games with his father that night. He thought his mother had gone out. He denied ever leaving the house. His testimony was careful, measured, and heartbreaking because everyone in the courtroom knew the impossible position he was in. How do you testify against your father? How do you choose between the parent who raised you and the parent who was murdered? For Reggie, the answer was painful but clear. He told the truth as he remembered it, even knowing that his memory, filtered through the protective mechanisms of a traumatized 6-year-old mind, might not be the complete truth. When Reggie later watched that videotape from 1987, the one where he served as his father's alibi, he broke down. It was like looking in the mirror, he said. That's a lot to take in to realize that you could be the key to someone's freedom. But he also said something else, something that revealed the depth of his internal conflict. With my dad, he is my dad. At the end of the day, no matter what he's done. This is the tragedy of children raised by those who have committed terrible crimes. They love the person who raised them, even when that person is a monster. They are loyal to the only parent they've ever really known, even when that parent murdered their mother. On November 18, 2022, after hearing weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. They reviewed the evidence, the DNA on the cigarette, the life insurance policies, the contradictions in Reginald's story, the witness who saw him at the crime scene, the scratches on his neck, the immaculately clean house, the history of domestic abuse, Jimmy Ray Barnes's testimony. And they reached a verdict: guilty. Reginald Reed Sr., now 71 years old, was convicted of second-degree murder in the death of his wife, Selonia Ophelia Smith Reed. Judge Brenda Ricks sentenced him to mandatory life imprisonment at hard labor without the possibility of parole, probation, or suspension of sentence. The courtroom erupted. Salonia's sisters wept, tears of grief for the sister they had lost 35 years earlier, tears of relief that justice had finally arrived, tears of anger that it had taken so long. Reginald Reed showed no emotion. He sat stoically as the verdict was read, as his fate was sealed, as the life he had built on his wife's murder finally collapsed around him. For Reggie, the verdict brought no comfort. "I don't feel like I won," he said after the trial. "Because either way, I lost my mother, and now my father's going to prison for the rest of his life." He was 41 years old, married with children of his own, and he was an orphan. In the years since his father's conviction, Reggie Reed has had to reconstruct his entire understanding of his own life. Everything he thought he knew about his family, his childhood, his father, all of it has been recontextualized by the truth of what happened on August 22, 1987. Reggie has spoken publicly about his experience, not because he wants attention, but because he knows there are other children in similar situations. Children being raised by parents who have committed terrible crimes, children who serve as unwitting alibis, children who grow up in the shadow of violence they don't fully understand. "When you're a child, you believe what adults tell you," Reggie said in an interview. "You trust them completely. I had no reason to question my father's story because I was 6 years old. I didn't know any better. But now he does know better. Now he understands that his mother didn't go out with a friend that night. She was murdered in her own bedroom, likely while he slept just rooms away. Her killer then woke him up, played video games with him, used him as an alibi, and raised him for the next 35 years. The psychological complexity of this reality is almost unfathomable. Reggie has had to grieve for his mother all over again, not just for the woman he lost at age 6, but for the truth about how she died and who killed her. He has had to process the betrayal of being used as an alibi by the man who murdered his mother. And he has had to reconcile his love for his father with the horror of what his father did. "I won't defend what he did," Reggie has said. "But he's still my dad. That's a complicated thing to live with." Some people might judge Reggie for maintaining any emotional connection to his father. How can you love a murderer? How can you still call him dad after what he did? But those questions miss the fundamental reality of human psychology. We cannot simply turn off our attachments, especially those formed in childhood. Reggie's relationship with his father, however fraught and complicated, is part of who he is. Denying it wouldn't make it disappear. It would only add another layer of trauma to an already traumatic story. For Gwen and Jackie, Salonia's sisters, the verdict brought a bittersweet kind of closure. They had spent 35 years wondering if their sister's killer would ever be brought to justice. They had watched Reginald walk free, run for mayor, collect life insurance money, and live his life while Salonia remained forever 26 years old, frozen in time at the moment of her brutal death. "I always knew it was him," Gwen said after the verdict. "From the beginning, I knew. But knowing and proving are two different things." The sisters have had to live with their own complicated grief. They lost not just Salonia, but also regular contact with their nephew Reggie, who was raised by the man who killed their sister. They had to watch from a distance as Reginald raised Salonia's son, wondering what kind of man the child would become, hoping he wouldn't absorb his father's violence. Fortunately, by all accounts, Reggie did not become his father. He broke the cycle of violence. He became a husband, a father, a decent man trying to make sense of an impossible situation. For Salonia's sisters, Reggie represents both tremendous loss and tremendous hope, the nephew they couldn't protect, but who somehow survived and thrived despite everything. This case raises uncomfortable questions about the American criminal justice system. Why did it take 35 years to bring Reginald Reed to trial? What systemic failures allowed a man who murdered his wife to walk free for more than 3 decades? Part of the answer is technological. In 1987, DNA testing was rudimentary. The cigarette butt found at the crime scene couldn't be properly analyzed until 2012. Without that DNA match to Jimmy Ray Barnes, and without Barnes's eventual testimony, prosecutors didn't feel they had enough evidence for a conviction. But technology isn't the whole story. There was plenty of circumstantial evidence in 1987 that pointed to Reginald Reed, the contradictions in his story, the witness who placed him at the crime scene, the scratches on his neck, the cleaned house, the history of domestic violence, the life insurance policies. The truth is that prosecutors in small-town Louisiana in the late 1980s were reluctant to bring a case to trial unless they were certain of a conviction. Circumstantial evidence, no matter how compelling, felt too risky. They wanted physical evidence, eyewitness testimony, something definitive. So they waited. And while they waited, Reginald Reed lived free. He collected $700,000 in life insurance money. He raised Salonia's son. He ran for mayor. He became a respected member of his community. And Salonia remained dead, her murder unsolved, her family without justice. It took the determination of a few key people to finally break the case open. H.L. Arledge, the journalist who wouldn't let the story die, Lieutenant Barry Ward, who saw potential in old evidence, Taylor Anthony, the young prosecutor who treated a 31-year-old case like it happened yesterday, and District Attorney Scott Perilou, who was willing to take a financial and professional risk by sending his team to Georgia. Without any one of these people, Reginald Reed might still be a free man today. Selonia Reed's murder is, tragically, not unique. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, approximately half of all female homicide victims in the United States are killed by current or former intimate partners. When we hear statistics like that, it's easy to become numb to the numbers. But behind every statistic is a woman like Salonia, someone with dreams, relationships, a life she was living, a child she was raising. Someone whose death left a permanent hole in the world. Domestic violence follows predictable patterns, and Salonia's case exhibits many of them. Escalation. The abuse gets worse over time. Control. The abuser tries to isolate the victim and control their behavior. Fear of leaving. The most dangerous time for a victim is when they try to leave the relationship. Financial abuse. Using money to maintain control. By all accounts, Salonia had been planning to leave Reginald. She had spoken to her sisters about divorce. This wasn't a secret, it was something Reginald would have known or suspected. And for a controlling, violent man, the thought of his wife leaving him, taking his son, destroying the image of his perfect family, would have been intolerable. So he made sure she could never leave. He took out life insurance policies on her life, waited for the right moment, murdered her in their bedroom, staged the scene to make it look like a random sexual assault, and used his 6-year-old son as an alibi. It was premeditated. It was calculated. It was evil. One of the most disturbing aspects of this case is how normal Reginald Reed appeared to those who didn't know what happened behind closed doors. He worked. He provided for his family. He raised his son. He ran for political office. He was, by many external measures, a respectable member of his community. This is the paradox of human evil. It often doesn't look like we expect it to look. We imagine monsters as obviously monstrous, grotesque, terrifying, clearly identifiable. But real evil often wears a mask of normalcy. It goes to work every day. It pays its bills. It attends church. It waves to the neighbors. Reginald Reed's evil was hidden behind the facade of a grieving widower, a single father, a man who had supposedly lost the love of his life to a brutal random attack. He played that role for 35 years, and he played it well enough that he almost got away with murder. This should terrify us, because it means that the person sitting next to you in church, working in the office down the hall, coaching your child's soccer team, that person could be hiding something terrible. Evil doesn't announce itself. It camouflages itself in everyday normalcy. And this should also make us more compassionate toward victims of domestic violence. When a woman says her partner is abusing her, when she asks for help, when she tries to leave, we need to believe her. Because the alternative is that we enable evil to continue hiding in plain sight. Is Reginald Reed capable of remorse? Can a man who brutally murdered his wife, used his young son as an alibi, and lived free for 35 years while maintaining his innocence ever truly acknowledge what he's done? Throughout his trial, Reginald maintained his innocence. He showed no emotion when the verdict was read. He has never confessed. He has never apologized to Salonia's family. He has never expressed remorse. Some would say this proves he's a sociopath, someone fundamentally incapable of empathy or moral feeling. Others might argue he's simply maintaining his legal strategy, refusing to admit guilt because admission would destroy any hope of appeal. But here's what we know for certain: Reginald Reed took Salonia's life. He took away Reggie's mother. He robbed Salonia's sisters of their beloved sibling. He ended a bright, generous, caring woman's existence because he couldn't tolerate her independence. And for that, there can be no adequate punishment. Life in prison doesn't bring Salonia back. It doesn't erase the 35 years of freedom Reginald enjoyed while Salonia lay in a grave. It doesn't heal Reggie's trauma or restore the childhood that was stolen from him. Justice, in this case, is both necessary and insufficient. Necessary because societies must hold murderers accountable. Insufficient because no earthly justice can truly balance the scales when human life has been taken. The question of forgiveness, then, is not really about Reginald Reed. It's about Salonia's family. Can they forgive? Should they forgive? Do they want to forgive? These are questions each of them must answer for themselves, in their own time, in their own way. There is no correct answer. Forgiveness is not required for healing, though some people find it helps. Anger is not a sign of weakness, it's a natural response to injustice. What matters is that Salonia is remembered, not just as a victim, but as the vibrant, generous, loving woman she was before Reginald Reed decided she had no right to exist. In the decades since her murder, Salonia Reed has often been reduced to her death, defined by the violence inflicted upon her, by the crime scene photographs, by the trial testimony. This is the tragedy of murder victims. Their deaths become more famous than their lives. So let's remember Salonia not for how she died, but for how she lived. She was a daughter who made her parents proud. She was a sister who formed unbreakable bonds with Gwen and Jackie. She was a friend who people could count on. She was a hospital worker who cared for patients with genuine compassion. She was a bank teller who greeted customers with warmth. She was a mother who adored her son and made him feel like the center of the universe. She had dreams. She had plans. She was contemplating divorce, yes, but divorce means she was planning a future where she would be safe, where she could raise Reggie in peace, where she could find happiness again. That future was stolen from her on August 22, 1987. But for 26 years before that, Salonia lived fully. She loved deeply. She mattered to people. And she still matters. She matters to her sisters, who have never stopped missing her. She matters to her son, who wishes he had memories of her beyond that chocolate chip cookie at Hammond Square Mall. She matters to everyone who believes that women deserve to live without fear, that domestic violence is never acceptable, that murder must be punished no matter how many years have passed. Reggie Reed has found a kind of purpose in his tragedy. He has become an advocate for other children of criminals, for other families dealing with cold cases, for other people trying to make sense of the senseless. His message is simple but profound: don't let them define you. He's talking about the perpetrators, the murderers, the people who commit evil acts. Their evil doesn't have to become your identity. You can acknowledge what they did, grieve for what was lost, and still build a meaningful life. Reggie did not become his father. He broke the cycle. He chose a different path. My dad made his choices, Reggie has said. Those were his choices. I get to make my own choices. And I choose to honor my mother by living a good life, by being a good father, by being the kind of person she would have been proud of. This is Reggie's triumph. Not that he escaped his father's evil, but that he refused to let that evil define him. He carries the weight of his family's history, but he doesn't let it crush him. He acknowledges the complexity of his feelings for his father, while still holding him accountable for murder. If there is any light to be found in this dark story, it's in Reggie's resilience. It's in his ability to look at the worst thing that ever happened to him and say, this is part of my story, but it's not the whole story. Let's return one more time to that cigarette but found in Salonia's car in 1987. A Winston cigarette, smoked and discarded, seemingly insignificant among all the other evidence at the crime scene. For 25 years, it sat in an evidence locker waiting. Waiting for technology to advance. Waiting for someone to think of testing it. Waiting for its moment to speak. When Lieutenant Barry Ward finally had it tested in 2012, that cigarette became the key that unlocked 3.5 decades of silence. Jimmy Ray Barnes's DNA on that cigarette placed him at the crime scene. Once confronted with that evidence, Barnes made his deal and turned on Reginald Reed. One cigarette but one tiny piece of physical evidence. That's all it took to finally bring a murderer to justice. This is both encouraging and terrifying. Encouraging because it shows that evidence can survive, that cold cases can be solved, that advances in technology can breathe new life into old investigations. Terrifying because it means that Reginald Reed came within one cigarette but of getting away with murder forever. If Barnes hadn't smoked at the crime scene, or if that particular cigarette had been overlooked, or if the DNA testing had been unsuccessful, Reginald might still be free today. Justice hung by the thinnest of threads. But the thread held. The cigarette was found. The DNA matched. The case was solved. And now Reginald Reed will spend the rest of his life in prison, with nothing but his memories and his conscience, if he has one, for company. On November 18, 2022, justice finally caught up with Reginald Reed. It was 35 years, 2 months, and 27 days after he murdered his wife. 12,775 days that Reginald spent as a free man while Salonia lay in a grave. 12,775 days that Reggie grew up without his mother. 12,775 days that Salonia's sisters waited for justice. Was it worth the wait? Ask Salonia's family, and they'll tell you, justice delayed is justice denied. But justice eventually delivered is still better than no justice at all. This case reminds us of several uncomfortable truths. First, that domestic violence can happen in any home, behind any closed door, in any community. It doesn't discriminate by race, class, education, or religion. And the most dangerous time for a victim is when they try to leave. Second, that evil often looks ordinary. Monsters don't always announce themselves as such. Sometimes they look like respectable members of the community. Sometimes they're the person sitting across from you at the dinner table. Third, that children are often the invisible victims of violent crime. Reggie didn't choose to be born into this family. He didn't choose to witness the aftermath of his mother's murder. He didn't choose to become his father's alibi. But he has had to live with the consequences of his father's choices for his entire life. Fourth, that cold cases matter. Every unsolved murder represents not just a failure of the justice system, but an ongoing wound for the victim's family. The families of murder victims don't get closure just because time passes. They carry that grief every single day, waiting, hoping, praying that someday someone will care enough to find answers. And finally, that persistence matters. This case was solved because a handful of people refused to give up. A journalist who kept writing about it. A detective who revisited old evidence. A prosecutor who treated it like it happened yesterday. These people, working together across decades, made justice possible. We began this story with a 6-year-old boy and a chocolate chip cookie at Hammond Square Mall. We end it with a 41-year-old man who understands, finally and completely, what that cookie meant. It was his mother's last gift to him. The last time she chose something just for him. The last time she smiled at him with nothing but love in her eyes. Every child deserves a mother's love. Reggie got 6 years of it, precious, irreplaceable years that nothing can take away. But he should have had a lifetime. Salonia should have watched her son grow up. She should have been at his high school graduation. She should have met his wife. She should have held her grandchildren. She should have grown old, surrounded by family, filled with memories of a life well lived. Instead, she was murdered at 26, her body brutalized and displayed, her death staged to look like something other than what it was, a husband's final assertion of control over a wife who dared to dream of freedom. But Salonia's story doesn't end with her murder. It continues in her sisters, who fought for justice. It continues in her son, who broke the cycle of violence. It continues in everyone who hears this story and decides to do better, to be kinder, to listen when someone says they're being abused, to believe survivors, to fight for justice even when it seems impossible. Selonia Reed lived for 26 years. She has been dead for 35. But she is not forgotten. And as long as we remember her, not as a victim, but as a person who deserved to live, who deserved to be safe, who deserved justice, then her life still means something. That chocolate chip cookie at Hammond Square Mall was more than just a treat from a mother to her son. It was love, crystallized into a moment that would survive everything that came after. Reggie still remembers the taste of it. Sweet, simple, perfect. It's the taste of a mother's love. And it's the taste of goodbye. In memory of Salonia Ophelia Smith Reed, December 13, 1960, August 22, 1987. Gone but not forgotten. Justice delayed, but finally delivered. May she rest in peace. Afterward, resources for domestic violence survivors. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please know that help is available. National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-799-7233, available 24 hours 7 days, confidential and free. You deserve to be safe. You deserve to be believed. You deserve justice. Don't wait for the violence to escalate. Don't hope it will get better on its own. Don't sacrifice your safety for someone else's reputation. Salonia tried to leave. She spoke to her sisters about divorce. She was planning a future without her abuser. But she ran out of time. Don't let that be your story. Reach out. Get help. Make a plan. Leave safely. Your life is worth saving. This story is dedicated to all the victims of intimate partner violence, to the families who wait for justice, to the children who grow up in the shadow of tragedy, and to the investigators, journalists, and prosecutors who refuse to let cold cases stay cold. May Salonia Reed's memory be a blessing, and may her story save lives.